Hello, and welcome to the Unseen Question. The idea of eternal life has been promoted as the greatest prize imaginable, a reward so perfect that nothing could possibly compare to it. But when you look past the glow of promises and the poetry of religious texts, the very concept of eternal life starts to unravel. At first glance, it sounds like the ultimate dream, endless years without pain, without death, without the fear of losing what you love. It's supposed to be the perfect solution to the one problem that haunts every human being, the inevitability of death. Yet when you stop and really think about it, eternal life quickly reveals itself as a deeply flawed idea. Not just unlikely, but absurd on almost every level. The first issue is boredom. We like to think eternity would be full of joy, but our brains and our emotions weren't built for infinite time. Everything we value, love, beauty, excitement, even meaning itself, comes from scarcity, from the fact that moments don't last forever. A song moves us because it ends. A day is special because it passes. A life is precious because it has a limit. Remove the boundary of time, and you strip away the very framework that makes anything meaningful. Think about eating your favorite meal. The first bite is incredible. The second is satisfying. But if you kept eating forever, the very thing you once loved would become unbearable. The same logic applies to eternal existence. Joy relies on contrast. Without pain, there is no relief. Without struggle, there is no victory. Without death, there is no reason to value life. Eternal life would flatten every experience into dull repetition. And this isn't just a philosophical puzzle. Psychologists have studied the way humans adapt to pleasure. We have something called hedonic adaptation. No matter how good something feels, the effect wears off. Winning the lottery, getting a promotion, falling in love, all these highs fade as we get used to them. Now scale that up to eternity. Eventually, every joy would become routine. Every wonder would lose its spark. The best feelings would settle into numbness. This is where the concept of eternal paradise starts to look more like a curse than a gift. If the thrill of life depends on its shortness, then stretching it out forever doesn't preserve its value. It destroys it. What was meant to be the ultimate reward could easily become the ultimate punishment. Even the religious descriptions of eternal life reveal this problem. Endless singing, endless praise, endless worship. It's framed as bliss, but imagine doing anything forever, no matter how uplifting it sounds at first. Human beings are wired for curiosity, for change, for variety. To freeze us in a single state forever is not fulfillment. It's imprisonment dressed up as reward. There's also the problem of identity. Who would you even be after a billion years? Our sense of self is tied to memory, to growth, to change across a limited time. But eternity would stretch us so far beyond recognition that you would eventually vanish. If you lived forever, experiencing endless cycles of thought, eventually your mind would forget what it once was. The person who entered eternity would not be the same person existing in it after trillions of years. And at that point, what does it even mean to say it's you living on? And yet people cling to the promise of eternal life because it comforts them. Death is terrifying, and the idea of living forever feels like the perfect way out. But is it really comfort if the prize itself doesn't make sense? Promising eternal life is like offering someone an endless meal when they don't realize their appetite is finite. It sounds generous, but in practice it's empty. The irony is that, far from making life more meaningful, belief in eternal life can actually cheapen the life we already have. If eternity is guaranteed, then this brief existence becomes little more than a waiting room. Instead of cherishing the fragile moments, believers may see them as disposable. Why bother with this world if the real life is elsewhere and never-ending? But when you recognize the absurdity of eternity, something liberating happens. You start to see how rare and extraordinary it is that life ends, that we get only a short stretch of time. That limitation is what makes everything matter. It forces us to care, to choose, to love, to act, because we don't get forever. We also have to look at how the promise of eternal life affects the way societies function. When people are taught that eternity is their true destination, this world begins to feel less important. Governments, religious leaders, and entire cultures have often used the idea of eternity to justify neglecting problems here on Earth. Why solve hunger, injustice, or inequality if eternity will make it all irrelevant? Why question suffering if it can be brushed off as temporary compared to the endless future? This isn't just hypothetical. History is full of examples where the focus on eternal life led people to accept terrible conditions in the present. Serfs were told to endure their suffering because paradise awaited them. Women were told to stay obedient because their reward would come later. Slaves were told to keep their faith because their chains would not follow them into heaven. The idea of eternity was not just a private belief. It became a social tool for control. Even today, this logic lingers. Some people reject scientific progress, medical care, or even education because they believe earthly life is only a small test compared to the eternal one waiting. That mindset doesn't only affect the believer, it affects their families, their communities, and sometimes entire nations. The absurdity of eternal life becomes dangerous when it convinces people that this life doesn't really matter. There's another angle worth considering. Eternal life assumes that our minds could even handle it. Neuroscience suggests otherwise. Our brains evolved to handle a limited span, decades, maybe a century with medicine. Memory fades, attention struggles, and identity breaks down even within a single lifetime. Stretch that into infinity, and the system simply doesn't work. A mind built for 80 years cannot function coherently for 1 billion. At some point, memory overload or psychological collapse would be inevitable. And then comes the question of relationships. Eternal life is often painted as the place where you'll reunite with loved ones forever. That sounds heartwarming, but think about it more carefully. The very thing that makes relationships meaningful is their fleeting nature. We cherish time with family and friends precisely because we know it won't last. Now imagine being stuck with every relative, every friend, every partner forever. Even the strongest bond could erode into strain under infinite time. The joy of reunion would eventually sour into routine. Even worse, the problem of choice remains unsolved. If you could live forever, you would eventually have to face every possibility. Every friendship would eventually fray. Every marriage would dissolve under the weight of endless repetition. Every promise would be tested beyond recognition. The eternal reunion becomes eternal erosion. Now, some might argue that in eternity, our emotions would be transformed, that boredom, fatigue, and frustration wouldn't exist. But if you remove those things, you also remove the very human experience. A person without struggle or frustration isn't a person anymore. They're something else entirely, stripped of the very traits that made them human. If that's the price of eternal life, then what's really being promised is not life at all, but a hollow imitation of it. There's also a hidden contradiction. If eternal life is perfect, then nothing can change. Perfection means no growth, no development, no surprise. But if nothing changes, what do you actually do for eternity? Without change, time loses meaning. An eternal now is indistinguishable from non-existence. It's less like life and more like being frozen in a single snapshot that never ends. And what about justice? Eternal life is often paired with eternal punishment. For many religions, the flip side of heaven is hell, eternal suffering for those who don't qualify. But eternity works against the very idea of justice. Even the worst crime is finite, committed in the span of years. To punish it with infinite torment is not just unfair, it's nonsensical. Eternal punishment makes as little sense as eternal reward. Both collapse under the weight of infinity. So we find ourselves at a strange crossroads. The one prize humanity has been taught to crave more than anything else, eternal life, is actually incoherent, psychologically impossible, socially harmful, and morally unbalanced. It doesn't work when you analyze it, and it doesn't even hold up when you picture yourself inside of it. The question then becomes, why do people cling so strongly to it? The answer is both simple and profound. Eternal life is less about logic and more about fear. Fear of death, fear of loss, fear of meaninglessness. The idea of eternity is powerful, not because it's sensible, but because it soothes our deepest anxieties. But soothing isn't the same as true. Comforting words can still be empty promises. And the idea of eternal life is exactly that. It gives the illusion of control over death, when in reality it only distracts from the one truth that actually matters. Life ends, and that's what gives it value. Another overlooked issue is the paradox of choice in eternity. In a finite life, choice matters because you can't do everything. Every decision has weight because saying yes to one path means saying no to countless others. That's what makes choices meaningful. But in eternal life, you eventually get to try everything. Every career, every relationship, every hobby, every possible adventure. At first that might sound exciting, but once every choice is made and remade endlessly, the significance disappears. When you can do everything, nothing really matters. Think about reading a book. Part of what makes a story powerful is that it ends. If the pages stretched on forever, the narrative would collapse. No climax, no conclusion, just endless filler. Eternal life has the same problem. With no final chapter, the story of existence loses all tension, all urgency. Without an ending, there is no story. just noise stretched across infinity. This isn't just abstract philosophy. Studies in psychology show that people derive meaning from endings. Researchers found that when people are reminded of time limits, they report richer, more emotionally intense experiences. College seniors savor their final weeks more deeply than freshmen do. Patients facing the end of life often describe profound clarity about what really matters. Death sharpens life into focus. Without that endpoint, meaning fades into a blur. There's also the problem of creativity. Human culture, art, and innovation are driven by limitation. Musicians compose knowing they have only so many years to share their sound. Writers craft stories knowing their voices won't last forever. Painters create because they want something to outlive them. This urgency fuels brilliance. But in eternal life, there is no urgency, no pressure to create, no race against time. Art becomes optional, progress becomes unnecessary, expression becomes diluted. The fire that makes creativity burn bright is extinguished. And consider morality. In a finite world, morality arises from the knowledge that our actions have consequences in limited time. Harm done today can't be undone tomorrow once life ends. Kindness matters because it has a deadline. But in eternal life, every wrong can be drowned in endless time. Every good deed loses its sharpness against an infinite backdrop. Morality loses urgency. It stretches thin until it becomes meaningless. Even our sense of beauty depends on limitation. A sunset is moving because it lasts minutes, not millennia. Flowers are cherished because they bloom briefly and fade. Our appreciation of beauty comes from knowing it will not last forever. In eternity, beauty would stagnate. Nothing rare, nothing fleeting, nothing to lose, just endless permanence. And permanence is the enemy of wonder. Philosophers have pointed this out for centuries. Bernard Williams argued that an immortal life would be unbearable, not because of suffering, but because of monotony. After exhausting all possible experiences, existence would become a desert of meaninglessness. What's left to do after you've done everything 1,000,000,000,000 times? And here's a deeper paradox. If eternal life is so empty, then to keep it bearable, you'd need to erase memory. You'd need to forget the endless repetitions so each experience feels new. But if you erase memory, then it's no longer you living that eternity. It's just an endless chain of strangers wearing your face. Memory is identity, and if it's constantly wiped, you're not surviving. You're being replaced over and over. That's not eternal life. It's eternal death, disguised as survival. The more you examine the idea, the less coherent it becomes. It's sold as the ultimate gift, but when you look closely, it collapses under its own contradictions. If it's perfect, it can't change. If it changes, it can't be perfect. If it preserves your identity, it becomes unbearable. If it erases your identity, it's not really you. Every path leads to absurdity. And yet, billions of people structure their lives around this promise, shaping their choices, their morals, their politics, and even their wars. The irony is that the promise itself doesn't even make sense. It's like devoting your life to preparing for a trip to a country that doesn't exist. All that time, all that energy, invested in something that crumbles the moment you question it. But here's the key insight. Rejecting eternal life doesn't make life bleak. It makes life urgent, vivid, and real. Knowing that everything ends pushes us to live fully, to love fiercely, to make the most of what we have. Death doesn't rob life of meaning. It creates meaning. Without it, nothing would matter. When we zoom out to the level of society, the belief in eternal life creates consequences that stretch far beyond individual comfort. It doesn't just shape personal hopes, it directs entire cultures, economies, and political systems. One major effect is the way it redirects focus from the present world to a promised future. If eternity is the goal, then what happens here feels temporary, even disposable. This is why religious movements have often emphasized patience in suffering, why they've told people not to seek justice now but to wait for divine judgment. When eternity overshadows the present, real problems can be ignored or minimized. Think about how this plays out in politics. If a community believes this world is merely a test, then environmental destruction doesn't seem urgent. Poverty doesn't seem final. In fact, some groups even welcome catastrophe because they think it signals the end times and the start of eternity. The promise of eternal life doesn't just affect private beliefs, it shapes collective choices about the planet itself. There's also the issue of control. Eternal life is a powerful carrot. Religious authorities have long used it as leverage, promising eternal bliss for obedience and eternal suffering for disobedience. When the stakes are infinite, even the smallest rules gain terrifying weight. Missing a ritual, doubting a doctrine, or stepping out of line could risk eternity. That kind of fear keeps people compliant. Sociologists point out that this promise is one of the strongest tools of social discipline ever invented. What better way to control behavior than by attaching it to the ultimate prize and the ultimate punishment? No government, no law, no army can match the influence of eternal life dangled before believers. But there's a hidden cost. This obsession with eternity can stunt progress. When attention is fixed on the afterlife, innovation here slows down. Why invest in medicine if divine healing awaits? Why pursue justice if perfect judgment comes later? Entire civilizations have delayed solutions to human problems because they assumed eternity would solve them. Even on the individual level, there's a psychological trap. Belief in eternal life can discourage people from fully engaging with reality. If you think your real existence hasn't started yet, then you might treat this one like a rehearsal. Goals get postponed, risks avoided, relationships neglected. It's easier to drift because the pressure of finality is gone. Yet ironically, psychologists also find that when people accept mortality, they live with greater vitality. Awareness of death motivates action, sparks creativity, and deepens gratitude. Mortality is uncomfortable, but it's also energizing. Eternal life, by contrast, lulls people into a false comfort that quietly robs them of urgency. And then there's the problem of inequality. Eternal life is rarely promised equally. Different religions draw different lines. Some say only the faithful. Few will be saved, others say only those who obey particular rules. In every case, eternity becomes a tool of exclusion. It divides humanity into insiders and outsiders, worthy and unworthy. The absurdity compounds when you realize these divisions are based not on clear evidence but on arbitrary traditions and interpretations. So instead of uniting people, the promise of eternal life often creates division, judgment, and conflict. Wars have been fought, families split, and entire populations condemned, all because one group claims ownership of eternity over another. Even the psychological weight of eternal life is rarely acknowledged. Think about what it actually means to live forever. For many believers, the thought of eternity is exciting until they dwell on it too long. Infinity is overwhelming, even terrifying. Some philosophers call it the horror of immortality, a realization that stretches the mind past what it can handle. For some, this terror shows up in nightmares, anxiety, or even doubt they're afraid to voice. So the very promise meant to comfort can also quietly torment. It's supposed to remove fear, but instead it introduces a new one. Not just fear of death, but fear of endlessness. What emerges is a striking pattern. Eternal life is marketed as a solution, but it actually multiplies problems. It undermines meaning, erodes urgency, encourages control, divides communities, and unsettles the mind. The more closely you examine it, the less it resembles a reward, and the more it resembles a prison of contradictions. Across history, the belief in eternal life has left deep marks on human civilization. Temples, cathedrals, pyramids, and countless monuments were built with eternity in mind, not just as art or culture, but as investments in the afterlife. Entire economies were shaped by the idea that you could prepare for forever with offerings, rituals, or obedience. Think about the Egyptian pyramids, massive stone structures that consumed decades of labor, all for the sake of securing the pharaoh's eternal journey. Or medieval Europe, where peasants paid indulgences to shorten their time in purgatory, enriching the church while staying poor themselves. Eternal life wasn't just a personal dream. It was a political and economic engine, and the pattern repeats across cultures. Religious leaders promised eternity, and people paid with wealth, loyalty, and even their lives. Crusades, jihads, holy wars, armies marched because they believed eternal rewards awaited them. When the stakes are infinite, no earthly cost seems too high. But the tragedy is that these efforts were all aimed at something that collapses under scrutiny. Endless wealth spent, countless lives lost, societies steered, all chasing a prize that doesn't even make sense once you think it through. The absurdity of eternal life is not just personal, it's historical. It has shaped empires, justified suffering, and distracted humanity from building a better world here and now. And yet, there's a reason the idea has endured. Humans are unique in being aware of their own mortality. That awareness is heavy. We know our time is limited, and that knowledge creates anxiety. The promise of eternity acts like a balm. It eases the sting of death, even if it's false. People cling to it not because it's logical, but because it feels necessary. Philosophers and psychologists describe this as terror management. When faced with the inevitability of death, people grasp at systems that promise more. Religions that offer eternal life thrive because they soothe that fear. It's not evidence that drives belief, but the deep human need to avoid the finality of death. But here's where the twist comes in. When you step away from the illusion of eternity, you don't fall into despair, you fall into clarity. The truth that life ends doesn't diminish it, it sharpens it. Every moment becomes more vivid when you know it won't last. Love grows deeper when you know it's fragile. Choices matter more when you know they can't be redone forever. History shows that societies flourish most when they invest in the finite world. Science, art, democracy, human rights. These movements gained strength not from promises of eternity, but from people deciding this life is worth improving. Whenever humanity has shifted focus from the next world to this one, progress has accelerated. Rejecting eternal life doesn't strip meaning away, it restores it. It grounds meaning where it belongs, in the brief, astonishing span we actually have. A span that is all the more precious because it ends. This shift changes everything. It transforms morality from blind obedience to conscious responsibility. It transforms love from eternal contract to fragile treasure. It transforms beauty from static perfection to fleeting wonder. It transforms life from rehearsal into the main event. The absurdity of eternal life lies in the fact that it pretends to give us more, but actually leaves us with less. Less urgency, less creativity, less authenticity. Mortality, by contrast, gives us the gift of intensity, of focus, of true presence. When you step back and connect all the threads, the picture becomes clear. Eternal life is not just unlikely, it's incoherent. It can't deliver what it promises because the promise itself is flawed. The human mind is not built for infinity. Our emotions, our memory, our very sense of self, all of it is designed around limits. The boundaries of time are what give us identity, purpose, and meaning. Remove the boundary and the entire structure collapses. And it's not just about the mind, it's about culture, society, and history. The belief in eternal life has been used to control populations, excuse injustice, justify violence, and delay progress. It has shaped civilizations in ways that often hurt more than helped. Yet despite its contradictions, people cling to it. Why? Because it comforts, because it numbs the fear of death, because it paints a picture of reunion, of justice, of endless happiness. It's a fantasy that plays perfectly to our deepest vulnerabilities. But comfort is not truth. A fantasy that contradicts the very structure of reality is still a fantasy. And no matter how soothing it feels, it cannot change what life actually is. The irony is that facing mortality directly is far more powerful than hiding from it. When you accept that life ends, you begin to value it more. When you know time is limited, you stop wasting it. You see relationships for the fragile wonders they are. You recognize beauty in the fleeting moments. You pour energy into making this world better, instead of postponing hope to a world that will never come. This isn't bleak, it's liberating, because it means meaning is not handed down from eternity. It's created here, now, by us. Meaning isn't infinite, and that's exactly why it's precious. Think of it this way. A painting is meaningful because it has edges. A song is powerful because it has a final note. A life is valuable because it ends. The edges, the limits, the boundaries, they are what give shape to the experience. Without them, everything dissolves into emptiness. So the absurdity of eternal life is not just that it can't exist, it's that even if it could, it wouldn't give us what we want. It would rob us of the very things that make existence worth living. It would turn love into monotony, beauty into boredom, identity into confusion, and morality into irrelevance. Mortality, on the other hand, does the opposite. It intensifies every joy, sharpens every choice, and elevates every moment. It makes love urgent, beauty piercing, and time sacred. The end gives the middle its meaning. And that's the final twist. Eternal life, which is sold as the ultimate hope, is actually the ultimate emptiness. Mortality, which is feared as the ultimate loss, is actually the source of all value. We don't need eternity to matter. We need endings. We need limits. We need the fragile, fleeting gift of a life that begins and ends, because it's not eternity that makes us human. It's the fact that we don't last forever. So in the end, eternal life isn't just unrealistic, it's undesirable. The more you unpack it, the more it falls apart. It can't deliver meaning, it can't deliver joy, and it can't even deliver you beyond a certain point. It's a promise that collapses the moment you look at it closely. What does hold up, though, is the fragile truth of mortality. The fact that every breath we take counts, that every relationship is finite, that every opportunity comes once and then is gone. That's what makes life burn so brightly. That's what pushes us to care, to create, to connect. Think about your most treasured memory, a trip you took, a conversation that stayed with you, a moment of love or laughter. Would it mean as much if you knew you'd have infinite versions of it? Of course not. It's precious because it happened once, and it will never come again. That's what gives it weight, and that's what gives your life weight. Not eternity, but brevity. Not infinity, but the edges. The fact that it ends is what makes it worth living. Religions promise eternal life as if it's the greatest gift imaginable. But the real gift was always here, the chance to exist at all, to think, to feel, to love, to create, to share this brief window of awareness with others. It's not eternity that makes us rich, it's time running out, and maybe that's the greatest truth hidden in plain sight. We don't need a life that lasts forever. We need a life that matters now, because now is all we'll ever have, and that's enough.